The Long Road Home, Race, Class, and Recovery from Hurricane Katrina by Susan Kuta, Christopher Enrique, Gary Mitchell, Brian Boru, Melanie Gold, Matthew Schmidtlein, Christopher Burton, Ginny Melton. The 2005 Atlantic hurricane season was the most active season on record and produced 3 storms that reached Category 5 intensity: Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Hurricane Katrina was not the strongest of the 3 storms in terms of wind speed or center pressures, but could vary factors primarily in strength and landfall. Location along the Gulf Coast made it the most devastating and costly hurricane in U.S. history. It is estimated that Katrina impacted 90,000 square miles, an area nearly the size of the United Kingdom, displaced more than 1 million people, killed more than 1,300 people, and exceeded $80 billion in cost. Hurricane Katrina exposed the United States, and in particular the coastal population of Louisiana and Mississippi, to an unprecedented combination of natural forces and human failures. In the early morning of 19 August 2005, Katrina made landfall as a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 125 meters per hour and storm surges of up to 30 feet. Televised images of New Orleans show a city complete structural and institutional meltdown. The evacuees in New Orleans suffered from no power, no drinking water, dwindling food supplies, understaffed law enforcement, and delayed search and rescue activities. However, these issues were widespread and not confined to New Orleans. Indeed, they were characteristic for most of the area affected by Hurricane Katrina, a region stretching from southern Louisiana to the Alabama-Florida border. More than 100 days later, Congress approved $62 billion in hurricane relief aid. The Federal Emergency Management, FEMA, continues to operate 132 disaster recovery centers in the Gulf Coast area and has more than 14,000 federal personnel in the field. As of December 2005, FEMA had recovered nearly 53 million cubic yards of debris and had provided more than $5 billion in financial and housing assistance. Still, about 6,600 people remain unaccounted for, and more than 400,000 people are scattered among hotels and shelters all across the country. The challenge of recovery. With the immediate needs of clothing, housing, and food now addressed, local, state, and federal agencies face the challenging task of recovery and rebuilding. According to the model of recovery proposed by geographer Robert W. Cates and colleagues more than 25 years ago, the time period for each phase is 10 times greater than the one before it. In other words, the recovery period of Katrina will last 60 weeks. Based on an emergency phase of 6 weeks, and reconstruction could require a stunning 600 weeks, that is 11 and a half years. The reconstruction process includes the restoration of social routines and the commencement of economic activities. During this process, many of the evacuees will find new homes and new jobs and will enroll their children in schools somewhere other than their home communities. Many residents will not return to the affected area, even though they have the resources to do so. while others may wish to return but lack the financial or emotional ability. Either way, demographic change seems inevitable in the Gulf Coast region. The question of who will return and who will permanently relocate elsewhere poses a significant challenge for the recovery of the region. Hurricane Katrina brought national awareness to the deficiencies in preparedness and response to disasters, especially in urban areas. It is also highlighted some of the scientific shortcomings in understanding recovery and reconstruction after disasters in large cities. Past research on recovery from disasters found that relocation, especially among the elderly, result in increased physical and mental health maladies. Depression and other psychological problems are also prevalent among the residents living in the highly disruptive and traumatized community, because the individual and community coping mechanisms are not longer available. However, long-term large demographic shifts caused by natural disasters are unprecedented in the United States, where only a few studies have actually investigated post-disaster demographies. Lasting demographic changes are documented mostly in the context of biological hazards such as the AIDS epidemic or complex emergencies such as wars. The limited research on demographic change due to disasters is in sharp contrast to the much larger knowledge base on population's vulnerability prior to natural hazards. Socially marginalized people, that is, the poor, the uneducated, the young, and the old, are often more vulnerable to and slower to recover from disasters. When compounded by racial, ethnic, or gender disparities, the differential resilience of social groups, as well as the communities they inhabit, becomes more obvious. This helps explain the precursor condition as to why some communities bounce back after disasters, while others do not. It was not Hurricane Katrina's intensity, but its impact on a major U.S. urban area and the invisible inner city poor that turned this hurricane into the largest disaster in the U.S. history. Vulnerability and resilience, the broader framework. If vulnerability to hazards is the potential for loss, what increases or decreases that potential in different populations and places? What enables some people to avoid, resist, or recover from harm, while others are less successful? The concepts of exposure, resilience, and resilience are the starting point for our collective understanding of vulnerability. Exposure is the result of physical location and the character of the environment in a particular phase. Finishing communities in low-lying Louisiana Bayouts, are greatly exposed to coastal flooding and hurricane activity and are thus more physically vulnerable to those threats than places inland. Resistance refers to the capabilities of people to protect themselves and their communities from environmental threats. These capabilities may be economic or social systems that provide opportunities for greater security. A hazard-resistant community in that same bayou may be one with elevated home and a legally mandated setback distance from the water's edge, a sound setback. Both of these mitigation measures have reduced the hazard impacts. Finally, resilience acknowledges the ability or inability to cope and subsequently recover from disaster. The same Bayou community, if not diversified economically, may find its recovery options decimated along with the ecosystems on which it relies heavily for fish. Clearly, where and when exposure is high and resistance and resilience are low, the potential for loss increases. How do people and places come to be overly exposed, non-resistant and less resilient? These facets of vulnerability are fashioned by access to resources and social advantage. Populations are not vulnerable simply because they are exposed, but rather their plight is a result of marginality that makes their life a permanent emergency. This marginality was laid bare along the Gulf Coast. For example, one of the main reasons for the lower compliance with evacuation orders among the New Orleans poor was the Katrina struck on 29 August, 2 days before paychecks and welfare or disability checks would arrive, and they had no money to use for transportation. The mainstream press has portrayed vulnerability, especially social vulnerability, as a newly discovered condition revealed only through the immediate response of failures of local, state, and federal officials to Hurricane Katrina. However, social vulnerability is a well-developed scientific concept that transcends the expedients descriptions such as race, ethnicity, or poverty. Although it is still not well understood how each social factor works to produce vulnerability, or necessarily how factors come to work together as amplifiers or attenuators, several concepts have found acceptance within the hazard literature. Generally, this includes access to resources and political power, social capital and social networks, beliefs, culture and customs, type, construction materials, and age of buildings. Freight and physically limited individuals, and type and density of infrastructure and lifelines. Despite this simplistic portrayal in the mass media, for example, images of poor African Americans on rooftops contrasted with the interviews with wealthier whites who had escaped the worst of the flooding, actual maps showing the location of flooding and the percentage of minority population in the city of New Orleans provided a glimpse into understanding social vulnerability prior to Katrina, who might be affected in those physically vulnerable places was largely unreported, and indeed various social and or geographical nuances of each particular place, nuances that could alter outcomes significantly were likewise overlooked by the mass media. Have here an image. Despite the distance from shore, storm surges completely inundated this lower-income residential area in Biloxi, Mississippi. Such areas are often more vulnerable to disasters. Vulnerable places and the pattern of losses. Hurricanes are particularly devastating when making landfall in highly populated areas. With an increasing population along the Gulf Coast, property losses from natural disasters have been escalating since the 1960s. During this time frame, at least 11 tropical systems affected the area. See Figure 1 below. Figure 1. Historic natural disaster losses in selected Gulf Coast counties affected by Hurricane Katrina. In $1,000,000, we have Hilda, Betsy, Camila, Carmen, Frederick, Alicia, Elena, and Andrew, Luciana, Flood, and Opal, George, and Bertha from 1960 to 2000. Losses are in millions of dollars adjusted to 2004. During this time frame, at least 11 tropical systems affected the area and caused the majority of losses from all natural hazards. Table 1. Here, Table 1's top 10 counties in terms of losses from tropical storms and hurricanes since 1960 to 2003 have Alabama, $1,000,000, Louisiana, $1,000,000, and Mississippi, $1,000,000. The counties are Baldwin, Mobile, Choctaw, Connecticut, Monroe, Clark, Escambia, Washington, Butler, Covington, St. Mary, St. Martin, Lafayette, Vermilion, Acadia, Lafourche, Terrebonne, St. Tammany, Tangipahoa, Jefferson, Hancock, Harrison, Jackson, Pearl River, Greene, Perry, Wayne, Stone, Amite, Pike. And total losses. Note, losses are in $1,000,000 adjusted to 2004. Counties in italics belong to the storm surge and flood areas during Hurricane Katrina. In Louisiana and Mississippi, hurricanes account for about 50% of the state's losses from natural hazards, followed by flooding 30% and tornadoes 5%. See Figure 2 on page 14. Figure 2. Casual agent comparison of disaster losses by states since 1960 to 2003. We have Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. In Alabama, floods 24%, miscellaneous 30%, winter weather 11%, tornado 10%, severe storm 1%, and tropical storm and hurricanes 41%. In Louisiana, tropical storms and hurricanes 49%, severe storm 30%, tornado 3%, winter weather 5%, miscellaneous 10%, and floods 3%. And in Mississippi, tropical storms, hurricanes 49%, severe storm 1%, tornado 5%, winter weather 7%, miscellaneous 5%, and floods 33%. I think if Hurricane Katrina's coastal impact area, see Figure 3 on page 16, is acute stunt to damage from natural hazards, where more than $3.3 billion in property losses have been recorded in the period from 1960 through 2003. Figure 1, Figure 2, Figure 3. Figure 3, coastal counties experiencing floods or storm surge inundation during Hurricane Katrina. We have here Baldwin, Mobile, Jackson, Harris, Hancock, St. Tammany, Albans, St. Bernard, Jefferson, Plaquemines, Lafourche, Terrebonne. Flood and surge impacted coastal counties. This is a map. Some of the most destructive storms in the region were Hurricane Betsy in 1965, $1.4 billion, Hurricane Camilla, 1969, $1.4 billion, Hurricane Andrew, 1992, $26.5 billion, Hurricane Opal, 1995, $3 billion, and Hurricane Georges, 1998, $2.3 billion, which all rank among the costliest U.S. hurricanes. Hurricane Camilla ranks 11th among the most deadly continental U.S. hurricanes with 156 casualties. Hurricane Katrina has surpasses Hurricane Camille in fatalities and will eclipse Hurricane Andrew as the costliest hurricane in the U.S. history. In addition to wind damage and landfall, hurricanes are also associated with destruction from heavy rains, storm surge, flooding, and tornadoes. Just 4 years prior to Hurricane Camilla, Hurricane Betsy killed 75 people, but its lasting impression is mainly due to its flood damage to New Orleans. Betsy's storms surge raised the water level of Lake Pontchartrain and overwhelmed flood protection levels, subsequently inundating parts of the city. The storms revealed the city's precarious situation and its vulnerability to hurricanes, a revelation that was the ultimate impetus for the Flood Control Act in 1965, which funneled money to New Orleans to raise levee heights and upgrade the expand its pumping and canal infrastructure. However, the flood protection adjustments could not withstand the effects from the stalled frontal system in May 1995. As seen in Figure 1, property losses peaked in 1995 when the greater New Orleans area suffered from the worst flooding since Hurricane Betsy. Within 12 hours, 20 inches of rain fell in some areas, flooding thousands of homes, cars, and businesses. The bottom line here is the simple fact that New Orleans is below sea levels and sits in a bowl. It is just as vulnerable to the more common, heavily rainfall introduced flooding as it is to a less frequent hurricane. Thus, despite the levee system designed to protect it, New Orleans continues to be vulnerable to flooding regardless of the cause. Vulnerable people. Hurricane Katrina exposed the social vulnerability of coastal communities in vivid detail, and this was most pronounced in New Orleans. Yet these historical antecedents were there. The impoverishment of the South during the 1960s also extended the coastal counties where race, class, and gender most influenced the social vulnerability of these communities. Over the next 40 years, improvements in social conditions were seen throughout the nation, and the wide discrepancies in social vulnerability at the national level narrowed. However, this was not true for all places, especially Orleans Parish. For example, in 1960, Orleans Parish ranked in the top 3% of the most socially vulnerable counties nationally, the same percentile ranking it had in 2000. The differential vulnerability of counties is best seen when comparing those parishes and counties that were most affected by Hurricane Katrina's storm and storm surge and flooding. See Figure 4 on page 18. Figure 4 changes in social vulnerability based on scores on Social Vulnerability Index. SOVI. County have Jackson, Harrison, Hancock, Terrebonne, Saint Tammany, Saint Bernard, Plaquemines, Orleans, Lafourche, Jefferson, Mobile, Baldwin, and the SOVI score 1960s percentile and 2000 percentile. Note, the percentile of the impacted counties compared to all U.S. counties suggests that the region experiences greater social vulnerability than most U.S. counties, and there is variability within the Katrina-affected region as well. With one exception, Orleans Parish, all the affected counties have reduced their social vulnerability during the past 40 years. Yet, there are still significant disparities within the region. For example, Hancock counties, Mississippi, and Baldwin County, Alabama, are the least socially vulnerable, while St. Bernard, Orleans, and Plaquemines parishes, Louisiana, continue to be among the most socially vulnerable. This is the case on the national level as well. 85% of all U.S. counties are less socially vulnerable than these three parishes. What this suggests is while New Orleans have seen some incremental improvements in its overall social vulnerability during the past 4 decades, it is not better off today than it was in 1960. In fact, the dominant indicator of social vulnerability in 1960 in Orleans Parish, race and gender, are the same ones that are driving the production of social vulnerability today. It is evident that the capacity to recover from disasters is partially a function of the community's social vulnerability. For example, in the wake of Katrina, the lower 9th Ward in Orleans Parish had the largest concentration of red-tagged houses that were unsafe to enter and in imminent danger of collapse. This same area also experienced a disproportionate amount of fatalities in those areas within New Orleans where poverty rates are greater than 41%. Federally backed loans to homeowners average less than 10% of all loans made as of December 2005. Whether social vulnerability as measured by Social Vulnerability Index will continue on the same trajectory during the recovery and reconstruction of the Gulf Coast is unclear at present. Given the potential for major demographic changes in communities such as New Orleans Parish, where the lower 9th Ward will be uninhabitable for years and the population has resettled elsewhere, there may be some reversal of prior trends, but what social cost? Have here an image. The force of Hurricane Katrina storm search mob, shrimp boats, and other craft miles from where they were moored in Bayou La Bartre, Alabama. The forgotten coastline. While most media and national attention has been focused on New Orleans, devastation along the Mississippi and Alabama coastline poses equally challenging recovery issues. Unlike New Orleans, all 5 coastal counties in Mississippi and Alabama were affected by storm surge inundation as high as 30 feet in some locations. While storm surges hit some areas harder than others, it is underlying variation in social vulnerability that will lead to differential abilities to recover in the long term from this hurricane. To look more closely at the underlying social vulnerability within the coastal counties, it is necessary to downscale the Social Vulnerability Index to the census tract levels. Social vulnerability assessments were undertaken using census tracts within FEMA-designated counties of Mississippi and Alabama. See Figure 5A on page 19. Figure 5. Social vulnerability and storm surge inundation along the Mississippi and Alabama coasts. AB. It's the same image. Difference the social vulnerability in the first one, height, average, and low. And then in B, social vulnerability in storm surge zones, high, average, and low. In the same cases of Mississippi and Alabama. Note, when downscaling the Social Vulnerability Index SOVI to the sensor track level A, 4 areas stand with the highest levels of social vulnerability in these 2 states: Mobile, Alabama; Bayou La Batre, Alabama; Biloxi, Mississippi; and Pascagoula, Mississippi, superimposing the model storm surge inundation for Hurricane Katrina. B. Social vulnerability highlights 2 areas that may require additional recovery resources given their high levels of social vulnerability and the extent of storm surge: Biloxi and Bayou La Batre. When the model storm surge inundation is mapped and combined with social vulnerability data, a much clearer pattern of vulnerability and its scholarly resiliency appears. See Figure 5b on page 19. The longer-term prospects for 2 communities are worth noting. The first, Biloxi, Mississippi, was essentially destroyed by the impact of this storm along the coast. Picture of the beached floating barge casinos previously moored to the southern extents of the large hotels and grandstands could be seen on every newscast covering the story. The casinos, business parks, and flora, along with nearly every multi-million-dollar home along US Route 90, was completely destroyed by the storm surge in this area. In East Biloxi, low-income residential areas a few blocks north of Route 90 never made it onto the news because of a distinct lack of wow factors. However, these houses were comprised to such an extent that they were condemned and the residents rendered homeless. The differences between these 2 neighborhoods are seen not only in the height of the storm surge but more poignantly in terms of their social vulnerability. The more affluent homeowners and casinos along the immediate shorelines have begun reconstruction and renovations and have received insurance settlements. In largely African American and Asian neighborhoods on the northern side of the railroad tracks, where generations of low-income, blue-collar, and service sector residents live, the neighborhoods are still clogged with debris. Many are still living in or near the very houses that were condemned because they have no alternative sheltering option. The second area where differences in social vulnerability can be clearly distinguished in Bayou La Batre, a small coastal city in the southern Mobile County, Alabama, perhaps first brought to the limelight in the 1994 film Forrest Gump. Bayou La Batre was hit by more than 30 feet of storm surge from Hurricane Katrina. Just as in the film, this area is characterized by a high dependence on the single industry, shrimping. The impact of the storm of the area's natural resources base and industry infrastructure was tremendous. With more than half of the town's fleet of shrimp boats affected, shrimp boats were picked up and deposited literally miles from where they had been moored. Houses along the coast were completely covered by the storm surge, and like many in New Orleans, residents had to be rescued from rooftops during the actual storm event. While Biloxi and Bayou La Batre experienced a storm surge similar to places like Diamond Head, Mississippi, and Dauphin Island, Alabama, the impact of the inundation would have a much more lasting effect on Biloxi and Bayou La Batre because of the social vulnerability within the latter 2 communities. It is the intersection of the damaging physical hazard with the inability to adequately rebound from such hazards and reduces the resiliency of such communities and causes the most hardship for residents. The long road to recovery. The road to recovery will be a long one for the Gulf Coast. Communities will not recover equally or within the same time frame. In this variability in their rate and extent recovery will leave a lasting mark on the Gulf Coast landscape. Communities like Dauphin Island, Diamond Head of New Orleans Garden District were less vulnerable socially and will rebuild quickly using combination of federal and private insurance monies. Additional resources, federal, state, and private, and long-term investors will be required to obtain an equitable and socially just recovery for Biloxi, Bayou La Batre, and New Orleans, Lower's Ninth Ward. This investment includes job creation and less skilled individuals, affordable houses, access to public transportation, and above all, recognition that diversity and the social institutions that support it is key to the successful recovery of the region. But will this happen? And if so, at what cost? One unfortunate outcome of Hurricane Katrina will be the widening gap between the rich and the poor, and the near disappearance of the middle class in some particular hard-hit areas such as New Orleans. In many ways, the wealthy residents can afford the risk, and in all likelihood, most will rebuild. The poor, on the other hand, have little choice. Those who were relocated out of the region may be gone permanently. Those who stayed face the prospects of unaffordable housing and low-paying service jobs to meet the needs of the wealthy and tourist population. This is especially true in New Orleans. The primary pre-Katrina employers, the city, university, and health complexes are in financial distress, and increasingly there is an emphasis on tourism as the economic driver of recovery. The over-reliance on tourism for their economic base and the decline of the working middle-class residents does not bode well for the long-term economic or social sustainability of the metropolitan area. The looming question is, recovery from whom and by whom? The answer will vary considerably between communities and even within communities. Biloxi is illustrative of the challenge. Along the Mississippi coast, there is consensus among civic leaders that legalized gaming are going to be what saves us. The casinos that helped reverse the economic decline in 1990s generated $2.7 billion in revenues during the past year. The infusion of well-financed private capital into casino recovery within 6 weeks of the storm meant that the least 3 casinos were open for businesses by New Year's Day, 2006. A quick change to the state law, ostensibly to protect the casino structures and the industry, facilitated the speedy recovery effort as well. Gaming is no longer restricted to waterborne barges and may now take place in structures up to 800 feet from the shore. A larger gaming footprint is like as casinos built within the new setbacks but place hotel rooms, restaurants, and parking and adjust on adjacent land. This process is unfolding not just along the Gulf Shore, but along the back waterways, squeezing the real estate, a mix of commercial and resident land uses in between. This economically depressed neighborhood behind the casino lights, home to many gaming employees, were similarly devastated. Yet the residents find themselves in an increasingly untenable situation. To recover requires an income that may not return until the casino are fully operable. But the renewed operation of the casino is chipping away at their community, both in terms of new property acquisitions and the subsequent loss of social capital. As residents are forced to leave, what remains is a newly fortified haven for those who can afford to recreate in an area of high risk but not bear any of the consequences. Here's an image. Hurricane Katrina storm surge hit the western portion of Dauphin Island, Alabama, at more than 30 feet. Federal funds and insurance claim will have to many residents rebuild. Rebuilding bigger and better may be less important than rebuilding smarter. Clearly, more disaster-resistant structures must be part of the mix to withstand future storms. Equally important are the local land uses and zoning that will reduce the exposure to the built environment. While there are many ideas on how the recovery should proceed, we need to be aware of the permanent displacements of many of the region's poor. Any recovery and reconstruction of the Hurricane Katrina impact areas should be considered mechanisms for the repatriation of these former residents. Hurricane Katrina provides an unprecedented natural experiment for monitoring disaster recovery and reconstruction. See box on page 20. Disaster recovery and reconstruction research questions. A 600-week reconstruction and recovery period presents an uncommon opportunity to conduct longitudinal research for this natural experiment. Some questions of interest include: what mitigation measures are deployed and how do they vary among communities? Is the return home who comes back? Why do they return and where do they go? What social structures are most effective for long-term recovery in the region? Government, non-governmental organizations, faith-based or local grassroots? Who stayed behind, never left? Why did they stay in, and in which areas was this common? Which industries remain, restructure, or close? How does this transform the economic base of the region? How are places external to the impacted region affected by displaced people? Who will be the new poor if demographic change displaces them? Who will fill the gap? What is the mix of sustainable environmental practices and socially just development? What will create a more livable future for the Gulf Coast? It will necessitate considerable record keeping and oversight to ensure fairness to the process and equitable access to recovery resources. At the same time, there is also a critical need to distinguish between short-term and temporary demographic changes such as relocation and the more significant permanent demographic transition that is bound the effect of economic vitality and livability of this distinctive American region. In addition to these demographic changes, the raising a large section of New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast inevitably leads to concern about designification, a process whereby new representations of place are artificial and ignorant of history and the people who made the region what it was prior to the storm. It is an absolute certainty that these areas will be rebuilt. What is still unknown at this time is who will be living in these areas after the recovery is complete. For example, the large influx of Hispanic immigrants drawn by vacated service sector jobs and new reconstruction employment may or may not be temporary. How the short-term workforce situation affects prior residents is unknown at this time. If the previous residents, both voluntary and displaced evacuees, many of them African American, as well as the new immigrants, are not considered in long-term recovery efforts of the Gulf Coast, they will most likely not be in the picture at the end of the long transition back to normalcy. The decline in the rich diversity that once characterized the Gulf Coast region will lead to the loss of the cultural spirit and the historic sense of place that made it so unique.